Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today to hear the final presentations of this year's University of Washington Data Science for Social Good program. We're very excited to hear the results and to share those with you. My name's Sarah Stone, and I serve as the Executive Director for the eScience Institute here on the UW campus. The eScience Institute, if you haven't heard of us before, is kind of a hub for data-intensive discovery on campus. And we bring together data science practitioners from across all fields to engage and collaborate on a variety of different activities, ranging from everywhere from kind of drop-in office hours to longer-term programs like the Data Science for Social Good program, as well as seminars and special interest groups. If you're interested in data-intensive discovery and you're looking for a place to find peers and collaborators, you should check us out, and I encourage you to contact me if you have any questions. Before we launch into the talks today, I'd like to give you a little background about the Data Science for Social Good program, so you can have some context and kind of the framework of what the students are presenting today. So we started the Data Science for Social Good program in 2015, so this is our 5th iteration of this program. We were initially inspired by a similar program with the same name at the University of Chicago, which you may have heard of, as well as our own Data Science Winter Incubator program, which we continue to run during the winter quarter. But this program is really focused on bringing together students and researchers with a variety of different methodological backgrounds as well as domain backgrounds to work on focused collaborative projects for societal benefit. We think of data science as an institute very broadly, and I think within this program we think of what data science for social good is very broadly. And you'll see that reflected in the projects you hear about today. I think it's helpful to have some understanding of what how this program is structured and what our teams look like. So each summer we select 3 or 4 project teams. Projects are solicited from the community, and that community can be fairly extensive. We actually had a project a couple years ago that included data scientists who came from Kenya to participate in this project. But the projects come from academia, government, nonprofits, and we've even had industry lab participation. If this is something, after you hear about the projects today, that your organization might be interested in, you can look for a call for proposals towards the end of this year. So each project then consists of what we call 1 to 2 project leads, and the project leads are those folks who submitted the project proposal. And they're very integral to our program. The project leads, they're all in the room today, I think. I think we've got them all present. The project leads all spent, I think they would probably say, a minimum of 16 hours a week for the 10-week duration of our program, working in close collaboration with their teams. We believe this kind of integration between kind of the project owner and the data owner is really important for the nature of our program, making sure that the projects stay on track and also that we're using the data responsibly. The next members of the team are the student fellows. And so each team in this year and previous years has 4 to 5 student fellows. Student fellows come from a national application call. We get over 200 applications for 15 or 16 student fellow positions. So the fellows that you're going to hear from today are a really elite group of up-and-coming data scientists. They represent many different fields of studies and many different backgrounds. And we also think that's a real strength of this program. You may have heard of data science being referred to as a team sport, and I really think our program reflects that, because that strength of the projects and the project results really comes from this bringing together of various different disciplinary backgrounds and training experiences. They consist of graduate and advanced undergraduate students, and the call for student fellows goes out at the beginning of each year. So those in the room who might be interested in participating as a student fellow, look out for that call. On each team, we also have an eScience data scientist. eScience is extremely fortunate to have a very talented group of data scientists who are part of our core staff. And they provide the background backbone and support of all the programs that we run in eScience. And so the data scientists serve as a lead technical consultant and contributor to each of the DSSG teams. In addition, we've been very fortunate this year to have sort of a unique new role of having an interpretive data scientist who's been working across all teams. And that's been a position that we've kind of been developing and honing over the years and has been a real asset. I love these pictures. So early on, when the fellows have just met each other, they do a scavenger hunt on campus. And remember, some of these students are UW students, and you know, many are coming from across the country, and so they're just getting to know the university campus. And it's always fun to to see the pictures that they take on the first day. We are very excited and proud of the work that these teams have done, and I'd like to thank all the student fellows, project leads, and data scientists for their tremendous contributions and time spent on the program this summer. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the many folks who make this program possible, in particular Anissa Tanweer as our DSSG program chair, who really made this program what it is. And then I'd also like to thank Emily Keller for her role as a project coordinator, and our eScience support team, including Nikki Rise, Robin Brooks, student helpers Jennifer Vo and Justin Liu. So thank you all, and we're very excited to hear the results. One quick note before we get going on the projects is that the last of the projects that you'll hear about today deals with very sensitive subject matter, including things like self-harm, suicide, and violence. So feel free to sit that talk out if the content might be triggering for you. It will be the fourth and final presentation, and will begin around 3:30. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our first team up. I'm going to use their short-term names, so we always come up with shorthand names for the teams. And so we've got congestion pricing coming up. Where did my... Oh, there it is. Oh, changed into different... Okay. You guys have your notes? Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so hi everyone. We are the congestion pricing team that looked at congestion pricing equity here in our region. And I'm Shirley. This is Corey. That's CJ, and that's Kiana. So people love cars because cars are awesome. They give you freedom. And they let you hang out with your friends in your very own personal space while going wherever you want, whenever you want. It's no wonder then that congestion is a big problem in pretty much every major city. So this is a picture from the Seattle Times showing an especially bad traffic day from October 2016. On this day, it took over 2 hours to get from Everett to Seattle. So as we can see, we're no strangers to congestion right here at home. So congestion like this not only hurts productivity and wastes everyone's time, but it also causes pollution that's harmful to the environment and to people. Another big problem throughout the US is crumbling transportation infrastructure and lack of money to pay for maintenance or improvements to that infrastructure. So this is a section of Interstate 10 in California that collapsed after just some heavy rains. Okay, so tolling, though, is one possible solution that can solve both of these problems. Tolling makes it more expensive and therefore less desirable to drive, therefore reducing congestion. And tolling also generates money to supply services such as infrastructure improvement and maintenance. One increasingly popular type of tolling is hot or high occupancy toll lanes. And what these are is that they're lanes that allow high occupancy vehicles in for free, but apply a dynamically set price to sell the remaining space in the lane to single occupancy vehicles, all while maintaining performance, which in practical terms here means maintaining speeds of 45 miles per hour or greater 90% of the time during peak periods. So in particular, we're investigating the hot lanes on 405, which run both north and south between Bellevue and Linwood, as shown in red here. So these lanes were put into place in 2015, with tolls ranging from 75 cents to $10, and they're in effect from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. every weekday. Demand is so high for these lanes that the tolls routinely hit the $10 maximum and just kind of stay there through rush hour. Okay, so what happened to congestion after we implemented the hot lanes in 2015? So here on the y-axis, we show travel time in minutes, and on the x-axis, we have the time of day in hours, so going from about 10 a.m. to about 8 p.m. And these two blue curves show the average travel times throughout the day, going northbound from Bellevue all the way to Linwood, in the untolled, or what we're going to call general purpose lanes from here on out, before and after the hot lane implementation. So what you can see from this is that there was really no increase in congestion as measured by travel times in those GP lanes after the hot lanes were implemented. But you can also see easily that after implementation of these hot lanes, there were significant average travel time savings if you chose to travel in those hot lanes compared to those GP lanes. During the worst average traffic of the day, you could save approximately 30 minutes, for example, going from Bellevue to Linwood. So those were average travel times, but averages don't always give you the full picture, as you all know. So we went through our travel time data set for 2018, and we looked for one of the worst traffic days. So this is one of the worst traffic days going southbound from Linwood to Bellevue, and on this particular day, January 11th, you could have saved almost an entire hour by getting into those hot lanes.
So aside the benefits that Shirley mentioned, we should admit that most of the people, if not all of the people, hate tolls. And the fact that these lanes are commonly referred as Lexus lanes, which means that only higher income individual can use them and can get benefit from them, get us to one of the most debatable questions in the context of congestion pricing, which is whether or not congestion pricing is equitable. So our group tried to answer whether or not toll lanes on I-405 is equitable by answering some sub-questions that are relevant in this context. So the first question that comes into mind is that who are the users of these hot lanes? So this is relevant, but if we want to think about it more in depth and in the context of the equity, we realize that the better question would be who gets the overall benefits. So going back to the notion of the Lexus lane, maybe the higher income individuals are the ones who are using these lanes more often, but maybe their usage somehow subsidize the system for the lower income individuals to use it when they really need to use these lanes. So the other factor that we should consider is that all the drivers still have the option to use the general purpose lanes, which are the free alternative to the hot lanes. So that gets us to the next question, which is who benefit per trip. So the logic behind this unit of measurement is that similar to any other economic goods, we can say that higher income individuals can buy them in larger quantities, and that doesn't make those goods basically not equitable. We are also interested in the benefit per usage, or in this context, per trip. So to answer the questions that we have used multiple data sets. So the first data set that we have used is the data on the speed and volume of the hot lanes as well as general purpose lanes. So this data is used for calculating the travel time savings and travel time reliability, which CJ is going to talk about it in depth, and they are from the loop detectors along the corridor. The second data set is provided by the Washington Department of Transportation. So this data set includes the trip data of the toll users in 2018, and it has more than 16 million trips. Each of these trips includes the time of entry, time of exit, amount of toll paid, also a unique trip ID, which using these user IDs, we associate each of these user IDs to addresses. To de-identify the addresses, then the addresses are assigned to lower resolution geographic unit, which in this case was census block groups. So this picture shows a map of census block groups in the studied region. So basically, the census block groups are smaller than neighborhoods, and you can see in this map they are color-coded by the average household income. So the last data set that we use is the socio-demographic information about the census block groups, which are basically provided by American Community Survey. This data includes the number of households, the population, and income for each of these census block groups.
So this data set requires some really interesting methodological challenges. And unfortunately, we won't be able to get into the granularity of these methods, but we'd be happy to talk about it afterwards at the reception. But essentially what we do is we start with the trip level data, and we group those by the census block groups that were identified in the hot lane records. And then we also take that socio-demographic data that Kiana was talking about from the census, and we use a method called ecological regression. Because essentially the problem is we're trying to infer individual level characteristics from aggregate measures like census block groups. So we use ecological regression, which is often used by political scientists. The political scientists often use ecological regression to try to estimate individual level voter data from aggregate measures like state level data. So this essentially grants us the ability to look at an individual level income effect on variables of interest. So going back to the question that Kiana posed of who uses the hot lanes, this is kind of the first defining question. It's kind of the Lexus lane question. And if we use that method and plot income on the x-axis and the average trips per household on the y-axis, you can see that the average trips per household increase as income increases, meaning that higher income households are using the hot lanes more, which makes some intuitive sense. When you're looking at the 20th percentile income for the King and Snohomish counties compared to the 80th percentile income on this graph, you're seeing a 148% increase in usage. But it is worth mentioning that most of the households in the system are not at that really high income level. This graph is showing users across the facility, but it is worth noting that the people all along the higher income levels are using the facility at a lot larger level, but the users themselves, almost 80% of them earn less than $200,000 a year. So this kind of leads to the question of who benefits. And because we're data scientists, we naturally want to quantify this, and we do that using a kind of intuitive way, looking at travel time savings and reliability. And we like to visualize travel time savings and reliability by seeing a commuter who needs to be at work at 9 a.m. And they know their commute, it takes 30 minutes, but they also know that their commute can be variable. So they leave 15 minutes early to get to work on time 4 days a week. And that's what we use for these two measures. Reliability is essentially the variability in your commute time and that buffer time that you build into your commute, where travel time is the explicit time it takes to get from point A to point B. And now we want to go to our central goal of essentially making a net benefit measure for each trip. And the way we do that is by trying to put a value on this time and reliability. We take all of the factors that go into a decision-making process when you're driving in the general purpose lane and deciding whether or not to go in the hot lane. A lot of these things include toll, time savings, reliability, and some other factors like GP speed and volume and trip factors, which are those kind of conditional factors that you're seeing in the moment. We put all of these things into a model that shows how people use the hot lanes and when they use them, given the tolls and the benefits that they are provided. And from there, we get a value of time and reliability. Across the corridor, we can see that this value of time is around $53 an hour, and the value of reliability is around $26 an hour. So to put this in perspective, if you were on that really bad day in January 11th of 2018, you'd be willing to pay up to $56 an hour to save that 1 hour of travel time in the hot lanes. So now we kind of start accumulating all of this to get time savings in a dollar amount for each trip. We take the value of time in hours per or dollars per hour and multiply them by the travel time savings for each trip. And then you do the same exact thing for reliability. And from there, we get the equation for net benefits, which is just the travel time savings in a dollar amount plus the reliability savings and then subtracted by the toll. So this now gives us the ability to answer who's actually benefiting. We know who's using, but like, what are the actual equitable impacts? And if we plot the same graph, income on the x-axis, and this time net benefits per household on the y-axis, you can see a very similar relationship. Basically, higher income households are benefiting more than their low income counterparts, but this also makes some intuitive sense. If higher income users are using the facility more, it makes sense that they're going to be racking up benefits over the year. But now we come to the most interesting question, which is the one Kiana posed, and it's who benefits per trip. And once again, the rationale behind this is just because higher income people can buy more of an economic good doesn't necessarily mean that there are inequitable outcomes every time that they buy it. So we try to normalize by usage and just look at when people are entering the hot lanes, what benefits are they getting? So we're going to do the same graph. X-axis is income and Y is benefits per trip. And we actually see this relationship flip. So per trip, lower income drivers are getting more net benefit, even though overall higher income users are benefiting throughout the year. And Corey's going to explain a few more factors that are affecting this relationship.
So when we first saw this, we were a little surprised. And the thing is, we don't really know why this is happening. There's a lot of factors that could be contributing to this. Where you're traveling to, how often you're traveling, where you're traveling from, what time of day you're traveling, how often you use the system, all these sort of things could impact the pattern we saw there. And it's hard to tease out exactly which one is responsible or if there is a single factor that's responsible. But we do think that one of the important factors that explains that pattern is commuting patterns. And when I say commuting patterns, I'm really talking about two things. The first is which way you're traveling, south or north, and the second is the time of day that you're traveling. So the way the geography and jobs in the region work is that most people travel southbound in the morning and northbound at night. So those are the AM southbound peak users and the PM northbound peak users. There's a smaller group of people who go the opposite direction. So they go north in the morning to their job and come home southbound at night. We call those reverse commuters. And then lastly, there's people who maybe aren't following a traditional commute pattern, and those are the off-peak users. So they're traveling in the middle of the day. So once we've grouped people and trips into these four categories, natural question would be, well, how does this correlate with income? And so it turns out that lower income individuals travel more during these peak periods, when southbound in the morning and northbound at night. And we also know that it's during these periods that there's higher congestion, and therefore higher travel time savings and more reliability to be gained. And tolls are also higher, but it turns out that even despite the higher tolls in those periods, net benefits per trip are much higher in the morning, southbound, and in the evening, afternoon than those off-peak users and the people counter-commuting. And so we think that the fact that there's this association, that it's precisely when lower-income people are traveling at a higher rate that the net benefits are highest, we think this overlap does a pretty good job of explaining the pattern that we see, which is that net benefit per trip are higher for lower income individuals than higher income individuals. Now all this brings us back to our original question of whether the hot lanes are equitable. Are these Lexus lanes, or is the picture a little more complicated? So on the usage side, we've shown that higher income households use the lane more, but at the same time, most people who use the lanes are not high income households. There's a large chunk of users who are in the middle income range and use it once, twice, a couple times a year, even though, on average, overall, higher income households are making more trips. On the benefit side, we've seen that the usage pattern, higher income households using it more, translates right into benefits. So because they use it more, they get more benefits. But in that crucial question of benefits per trip, when you use it, how much benefit do you get? It's actually the opposite. Lower income households are getting more benefit per trip. Now, we've tried to argue that that pattern is slightly caused by when people are traveling and where they're traveling, which direction and what time of day. And what's cool is that the tolls are set by route and by time of day. So the exact same variables that impact usage and equity are all the same variables that are being used to set tolls. And so that means that the Department of Transportation has a lot of options and levers when it's trying to fine-tune equity and performance on the system and balance those against each other. I'd like to conclude by thanking all the sponsors that have funded the program, and in particular the Washington State Department of Transportation for their technical support and the data they provided to make this analysis possible. And we'll take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
So the lanes accommodate people that are willing to be told, but also the high occupancy vehicles, right? Does your data include the HOV vehicles, or were those data removed?
So the question was about the high occupancy vehicles. These are people who are 2 or more passengers off peak or 3 or more passengers on peak, and whether those were in the data and if they were, what we did with them. So the answer is that yes, we saw high occupancy vehicles in the data. We could also associate them to census blocks. We're not able to identify what kind of high occupancy vehicles we saw were. So the key distinction there is there's people who are carpooling, 2, 3, 4 people in the car, and then there's buses who carry a lot of people, a lot of volume, a lot of benefit there. And so we were not able to distinguish between buses and carpools, which means that it's a lot harder to quantify those benefits because, sure, the bus itself might get there 15 minutes faster, but that's multiplied by the 50 people on that bus, right? And so quantifying these transit benefits is a lot more tricky. We didn't quite have the time to be able to link the transit data to this to sort of answer that question.
Did your data lead to any conclusions about the value of raising or lowering minimum level of toll?
So the question was about what would happen, or sort of the potential impacts and the value of adjusting the toll pricing scheme along the corridor. And the answer there is it's really tricky to do those kind of analyses because there's a lot of factors that feed back on each other. If you change the tolls, it impacts the number of people who are in the lane, which impacts the performance of the lane, which makes the lanes more or less desirable, which makes people use the lanes more or less, and it all sort of feeds back and it gets this really hard thing to analyze. And so we have done some preliminary analyses, and we will be sharing those with the Department of Transportation. We don't have nearly enough sort of confidence in those to really be able to say one way or another what the impact would be of changing the toll pricing scheme. Yeah, so it's really hard to talk about, because we don't have individual level income information, right? And so, maybe you think you're going to save some time, you get in the lanes, turns out you didn't save any time at all, right? There's a negative net benefit. Maybe you are Bill Gates on the way to an important meeting, and your value of time is measured in the thousands of dollars per hour, right? The problem is when you're trying to talk about equity, is if you use a different value of time for each trip, you're basically rewarding people with a higher value of time. You shift your whole analysis to focus on that group. And so when we're talking about equity, what you really have to do is just use the average value of time across the whole corridor and see how that's impacted, even though you recognize there's a lot of heterogeneity at the individual trip level. Do you want to add something?
But that would maybe overinflate the benefit that you see that lower value to consider it
So the yeah. So the question was, did we consider, for example, people who just ended up not driving anymore because these tolls got put into effect? So the answer is no. And we really struggled with this at the beginning because we struggled to define what exactly equity is in the first place, and that was like a whole 3 weeks of us first being here. And so some economists, if you read the literature, basically say that if you really want to know if a toll is equitable, what really actually matters is, for example, how that revenue is then spent. So you could imagine that you have all high-income users using these toll lanes. They're paying for all of it, but then all of that revenue goes into subsidizing something for low-income people. And if the revenue is used that way, then some economists would argue that that's how you should define equity. So, and then another possible measure is exactly what you bring up, is well, who actually got taken off the road entirely? And we're not able to see those people. So we weren't able to do that kind of equity analysis, and that's why we focused on those 3 really specific questions that we showed. So yeah, we did our best with that.
Great work, everyone. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how the tools are collected, what kind of sensors there are, and if there would be a possibility for gradation tools for different incomes of users, and imagining that was possible, how would that change your analysis in terms of how you would determine the best allocation of resources?
Yeah, so the question was kind of regarding how tolls are collected and then the possibility of doing either a low income subsidy for certain tolls and that sort of thing. So that's a very interesting question, and that's also, it kind of led to the policy analysis that we've done, because it is very complicated in terms of, 1, price elasticities for people of different incomes, and then 2, the efficiency aspect and the attractiveness aspect of if you're putting a lot more lower income people into this lane, what are the effects on performance, and then subsequent price elasticity. But it is interesting because I think there's a House bill in committee right now that's kind of trying to address some of those things with a possible subsidy. But to answer your initial question, they do have toll plazas, and they scan you at each of these toll plazas. You set up an account usually, or you can pay by plate. So that solution is definitely feasible, but I'm sure administratively it would be very difficult to administer, but that's something that we definitely explored.
Okay, we're going to need a couple minutes of transition time here, and we have the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit group coming up.
Just this one.
You also need this for the sound, I think.
No, HDMI.
You don't? Okay, you've got the HDMI.
That's only for Mac.
Right, okay. I'm used to the other.
Should I have the audio on Zoom?
Yes, you can have the audio there. And then we'll do the sharing, however you brought that up. Or sorry,
And Vivian is coming remotely.
both Vivian and Daniella are pre-recorded, and then for Q&A, they're kind of.
Okay. You guys are explaining that.
Oh, we need to.
The City of Seattle and many others use these technologies, perhaps without considering
Yeah, change it to slide 1. Who's doing the very intro? Same, this first slide. Okay. Just move it over that. Yeah. Okay. So it's good. And then we go to Zoom. And
Hi,
everyone, my name is Corinne. We have two remote members with us today. Daniella and Vivian are joining us by Zoom.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit.
Are we using the clicker?
Okay, so on July 7th, 2019, the Washington Post broke the story that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which we know as ICE, had scanned through millions of Americans' driver's license photos illegally without the approval of state legislators or consent from the individual driver license holders. ICE was running facial recognition searches in search of finding matches for undocumented immigrants. They were especially interested in the DMV databases for Washington, Vermont, and Utah because these states' undocumented immigrants can obtain a driver's license. So this is just one of the many headlines that we see every day about surveillance and automated decision systems, and they have an impact on all of us. So in this presentation and throughout the summer and our project in general, we worked with two main concepts, surveillance and automated decision systems. So we kind of had trouble finding a strict definition for each of these, but in general, surveillance systems collect data about the mass population, and automated decision systems use that collected data to make decisions. So in the previous ICE example, the collection of driver's license photos would be the surveillance system, and the use of those driver's license photos through the facial recognition software would be the automated decision system. Now, we might not think about having our photo taken for a driver's license as being a surveillance system, but we also don't anticipate that it will be run through a facial recognition system. And next, Daniella will talk about the kind of legislation that surrounds these different systems. You might need to unmute.
The City of Seattle and many others use these technologies perhaps without considering the implications. However, in 2013, Black Lives Matter protests on systemic racism, violence in policing, and drone use resulted in the Seattle 2013 Surveillance Ordinance. This ordinance required a reporting process with new devices requiring council approval. Notably, this ordinance was the first of its kind in terms of city surveillance ordinance. In 2016, The Stranger reported that the Seattle police was using social media surveillance software. However, this technology did not qualify as a device under review by the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance because it was deemed software and not hardware. This led to community pushback and an ACLU national policy campaign, resulting in an updated 2017 Seattle Surveillance Ordinance. This new ordinance requires a report created by a diverse task force of stakeholders prior to approval and a master list of surveillance technology. In 2019, two additional pieces of legislation were introduced by the ACLU to help regulate facial recognition and automated decision systems. This did not pass despite there being currently no state laws regulating their use. Among our stakeholders are the ACLU, which works to defend and preserve both the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to us by the Constitution and other U.S. laws. The ACLU has had a long history defending privacy rights, both in Seattle and nationally. We worked specifically with the ACLU's community-centered Tech Fairness Coalition partners, DENSHO, and the Council on American Islamic Relations, also known as CARE. DENSHO works to preserve and share the history of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans, with the aim of promoting equity and justice today. CARE's mission is to enhance understanding of Islam, protect civil rights, promote justice, and empower American Muslims. We partnered with these groups specifically because of their long history of involvement in civil rights activism and because they represent groups that have been disproportionately targeted by government surveillance. The output created over the summer is a toolkit that the ACLU can share with community members of organizations like DENSHO and CARE who may or may not be technically savvy. Over to Aaron to describe the toolkit and our process.
So our solution to this problem was to create an algorithmic equity toolkit to empower civil rights activists to better hold their public officials accountable when using surveillance and automated decision system tools. And the reason why we targeted civil rights activists was because our stakeholders, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, noticed that there was a lack of understanding about how these technologies work. And even though these activists and these civil rights groups are most heavily impacted by the use of these technologies. And so we created this toolkit with three parts. The first part is an interactive web demo so that civil rights activists can explore the potential algorithmic risks of surveillance and specifically facial recognition technology. We also created an identification guide for civil rights activists to be able to distinguish between surveillance and automated decision systems. And we also created a questionnaire to equip them with questions that they can ask of public officials to hold them accountable. And this is a timeline of our stakeholder engagement. As you can see here, we spent a lot of time having an iterative process to make sure that we met with stakeholders and got their feedback throughout the entire process. And that informed our prototypes, and then we'd meet again with stakeholders. And at the end, we had a summative process of evaluation and feedback with the Diverse Voices panel. And now I'll dive into the iterative feedback process that we used. This is an example of the identification guide prototype that we used to receive feedback with data scientists and stakeholders. We tested the accuracy of the definitions and the representation of surveillance and automated decision system concepts and definitions with data scientists, and received in-depth definitions and explanations. We also tested the usefulness and the clarity of the toolkit with civil rights activists, organizers, and leaders, and we used a Google survey and followed up with meeting discussions. And the Google survey would first test their initial knowledge, baseline knowledge of their understanding of automated decision systems, their level of concern, and comfort with engaging on these topics. This is an example of a question that asks about their familiarity with automated decision systems and asks for a definition. We then tested their knowledge, understanding, concerns, and comfort level with testifying on automated decision systems before and after reviewing the toolkit. As you can see here, the graph showed that the toolkit was effective in increasing the level of comfort on testifying on automated decision systems amongst all of the civil rights advocates that were asked in the survey. This demonstrates strong utility. We also had follow-up meetings to discuss any pain points, additional feedback, or any other questions they may have. We received comments that demonstrated that the toolkit could have improved on clarity. For instance, some stakeholders, like the top two here, asked about what laws there are currently regulating artificial intelligence. Others wanted the use case scenario for the toolkit to be more explicit, and so we made sure to incorporate some of this feedback into our toolkit. And now I'll dive into the Diverse Voices panel, which was a summative process for receiving feedback on the toolkit. The Diverse Voices panel was a method created here at UW by the UW Tech Policy Lab to gather input on tech policy papers. We met with 3 different stakeholder groups. We met with race and social justice leaders. We met with undocumented immigrant rights leaders. And we met with post-incarceration support leaders. We recorded our meetings, and we had 2 facilitators to prompt questions and take notes as seen here. We asked groups about how technology affects their communities currently, what feedback they have for our toolkit, and what more they would like to see more of in terms of the information in the toolkit. Afterwards, the facilitators would transcribe the audio and find themes from the meetings for revision of the toolkit. And now that we've talked about how we created this toolkit, I'll pass it on to Corinne to talk about the first component.
Okay, so the first of 3 components of our toolkit is the interactive web demo, which will look closely at facial recognition technology. Now, importantly, this demo does go into the inaccuracies and biases of facial recognition, but we want to emphasize that we don't believe that if these inaccuracies were fixed, the problem would just go away. We designed our toolkit to enable stakeholders to both examine the inaccuracies of technologies, but also think critically about whether or not they're appropriate for implementation, whether or not they're accurate or not. So going into the demo, how do I get the, there we go. Okay. So, as I said, the purpose of this demo is to look closely at facial recognition technology specifically. So, on We used OpenFace, which is an open source facial recognition model, to build this demo. We gathered our image data from a data set called Labeled Faces in the Wild, which has labeled celebrity photos. A lot of facial recognition software runs on data gathered from the internet, which has a high concentration of celebrities. So in this demo, on the left, you have a list of celebrity subjects that you can analyze. And then on the right, you see the 8 images that matched most closely to them. Under each image, you see what we refer to as the similarity score. So that's how similar this image is to your current subject at hand. On the bottom of the demo, you see this threshold. And this determines how similar 2 images need to be to qualify as a match. So right now, the threshold is set at 0, meaning the images don't really need to be similar at all to qualify as a match. And the more, as the threshold increases, the images need to be more similar. So if we go back to LeBron here, and set the threshold to 0.75, we can imagine that if I were an employee of a police department and LeBron was my subject at hand, and I set my threshold to 0.75, I would have 6 suspects to investigate as possible matches. Let's say these images on the right came from a prior records database. So 5 of these images are not LeBron, but they fall above the threshold, so they're false positives and are highlighted in red. The only true positive is the actual picture of him. If I increase the threshold to 0.9, we are left with only 3 matches because they have to be more similar. Now, the art of choosing this threshold is an art, not a science, and employees of a police department might not have the technical expertise to choose the right threshold. If we choose a different subject, Paris Hilton, let's say, and go to the same threshold, we see that she only matches with herself at the same threshold. The research literature that we looked closely at this summer shows that facial recognition software is not as accurate on individuals with darker skin, specifically women of color. So when a white woman is the subject, as Paris Hilton is here, the algorithm is much more accurate on her, and so it doesn't give her as many false positives at the same threshold. Another interesting example is if we go to Jacqueline Edwards, an Olympian, and if we gradually increase her threshold, we can see that she actually matches more closely with someone who's not her than to herself, which further shows this bias and inaccuracy in the algorithm. So we also included 2 case studies of facial recognition use in real life as part of this demo. So the first is the ICE example that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. And the second is the use of Amazon's facial recognition software tool Recognition in Oregon in Washington County, which is the county that Portland is in. They used this software in 2017, and they did not follow, Amazon recommends that they use a 99% similarity threshold if they're going to use this tool for law enforcement purposes, and it was found that they were not using this threshold. So this part of the toolkit, the demo, only dives deeply into facial recognition, and the rest of the other components of the toolkit will look more closely at surveillance systems and automated decision systems broadly. So I'll go and hand it off to Aaron to look at the next part of our toolkit, which is the ID guide.
Okay, so once again, this identification guide is to help civil rights activists be able to differentiate between surveillance and automated decision system technologies. And every aspect of this diagram was heavily informed by our data scientists and stakeholders. For instance, on the right here, you can see that there are definitions of surveillance technologies and automated decision system technologies. And we received feedbacks from stakeholders that they would like the definitions explicitly on the diagram. And we also provide examples of surveillance tool examples, such as microphone, camera, public records, and we also provide examples of automated decision systems, such as gunshot detectors, facial recognition, and social media surveillance. We also provided some of the major functions of automated decision systems and illustrated it with personalized definitions, such as facial recognition works by collecting images and video from a camera, and it matches similar facial images, and that's called clustering. And now I'll hand it off to Vivian to discuss the questionnaire portion.
Hello everyone, this is Vivian Guetler. and I'm joining the team remotely from West Virginia. I'm going to talk about a questionnaire, which is the third component of the toolkit. In addition to the guide, the purpose of the questionnaire is for community members to use it to ask questions about a particular technology presented to them. This is how the final questions will look like in the questionnaire, with the major questions numbered here 1 to 4, having follow-up questions which are available in the appendix if someone has more questions. The goal was to make the questions open-ended and in layman terms as possible so that community members can be able to use them to ask about our technology. We also have a use case example, how law enforcement uses facial recognition software, which is to help community members know how they can use the questionnaire when asking questions. So for instance, when they go to a Seattle police meeting and the police are reporting about the use of facial recognition software, the members can use the sample questions below to ask about the technology. The use case was added as one of the feedback we received from community stakeholders. They suggested adding an example case that will help users know how to use the questionnaire. The questions are designed in terms of categories. We have an impact, appropriate use, transparency, and accountability. The example questions for impact, for instance, would be who is most likely to be affected by technology? What are the effects of using this technology? And example questions of transparency and accountability would be how does a tool or system provide documentation about its design and function? How was the data collected and who was included in the sample population? Other questions that someone can ask about in terms of data privacy and security, interpretability of the technology, and operability. For instance, questions someone could ask about data privacy will be how does the technology address privacy concerns and how will the data be stored and disposed? So this concludes the illustration of the questionnaire. And the questionnaire was designed to help, or is designed to help community members surface potential harms in using the technologies. Now, these harms include privacy violations in the collection and storage of data, unwarranted surveillance by the use of automatic license plate readers, racial bias and profiling, disparities in policing, gender bias, stifling speech, and other civil liberties that may be harmed by using these technologies. And finally, the key takeaway of a project is that surveillance and ADS systems may be effective but have negative impacts on communities. And the next steps for this project will be to conduct further research on this topic and also implement feedback from diverse voices panels we received last week. And then finally, the ACLU will be able to distribute the toolkit to stakeholders and community organizations. Thank you, and my team will be able to take any questions that we have.
Any questions?
Yeah, definitely. Another example similar to what you just said was like the smart meter collection. So smart meters look at your electricity usage and try to, and try to like help you maybe be more efficient, but they can also be used to identify you based on like when you made breakfast, when you did this. And so I think the idea with our toolkit is that those kinds of examples that aren't as glaring would surface because you could come to see the privacy considerations. Because it's both the surveillance and how it's fed into the automated decision system that would be problematic.
Those questions that you set up at the last part of the toolkit,
Mm-hmm.
I thought are good questions that definitely need to be thought about in the community. But I guess my question is, do the officials using this technology necessarily know anything about how it works, or what the training data was used, and do you think they would actually care about knowing the answer?
Do you want to give that to Vivian?
Yeah. Let's hand this question off to Vivian. So, Vivian, the question was, the questionnaire had a lot of good questions, and do we actually expect public officials to care or understand fully how these surveillance technologies work? Vivian, you want to answer that question?
No, she's muted. She's muted also.
Yeah, she's muted.
But I don't think she wants to be muted. So we can, there you go, yeah.
She's unmuted.
Can we hear her?
So I did repeat the question, but we can't hear.
But you're muted.
Oh, okay. So Vivian, the question is, your questionnaire had a lot of good questions, but do we actually expect public officials to fully care or understand how surveillance technologies or automated decision system technologies work? All right.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to answer the question. Sorry, Vivian. Your mic isn't working. So yeah, absolutely. That's the role of the civil rights activists, is to hold their government officials accountable. We know that there was one research study that was done by our project leads where they asked technology experts at the city if they had any automated decision systems, and in their surveillance tools, they're required to have a list of surveillance tools as indicated by our presentation. And they said that they weren't really aware of any. And that's kind of the point, is not only is this toolkit here to educate the civil rights advocates, but also for being able to hold these government officials accountable. And maybe they could also educate their public officials about these uses and really have them think critically before they implement these technologies.
Yeah, adding on to that, in one of our diverse voices panels, it kind of came up as maybe this questionnaire could also be used within a community to kind of start conversations. So, right, like, will the official know the exact answers? Maybe not, but that can be a community discourse. Yeah.
So when it comes to finding the issues with machine learning models, a lot of them have biases, but in many cases it's a black box. We're trying to turn it into more of a glass box where it's interpretive. When we're talking to ACLU and trying to educate them to ask the right questions, have we talked to them about all these different types of models so they are armed with that knowledge, so they can then go back and say, hey, can we see that interpretive model so we can understand where those pieces are? Have you looked at those interpretive models? Is there an education path that's going on?
Right, like looking more at the engineering side of things, sort of like looking into the model and seeing where exactly, like what parameters could be tuned. Yeah, so that was kind of a conversation we had at the beginning of our project, was who was the audience for this toolkit, and we ended up steering it more towards the community organization, so having them ask the questions about like the use of the algorithms in general versus looking deeply into like the neural net itself and saying, oh, if you had this change. But I know there's a similar project that came out of the University of Chicago that was like auditing the actual algorithms itself. That just wasn't the exact audience for this project.
And in the identification guide for surveillance and automated decision systems, there is a discussion paper as well. We didn't show it here, but we do go into a little bit more explanation about how, for instance, classification or clustering works so that they can better understand the different functions and some of the basic functions. We didn't go into statistical versus non-statistical. We got feedback that that was too much information, and we got rid of dimensionality reduction. But some of these core concepts we did explain further in our toolkit, and we provided a glossary of for the terms as well. So we hope that with that better background and in-depth knowledge, they can be able to identify new technologies better and understand how they work.
And I think we need to
We can do one last question.
I'm interested in this toolkit and how it could be used for different audiences. Have you published it, and if so, what license?
It's not published yet, so that's still sort of the next step process. And we imagine it might be distributed through the stakeholders themselves, so like through the ACLU, but that is still kind of up in the air.
Do you anticipate what kind of license you might? Would it be a proprietary kind of thing, or?
It would probably be open access.
Let's go ahead and thank you. I don't know where the window went that was, here, let me. It was open, I don't know where it went. And I look at all my, how do I get it to the full screen? You wanna, why isn't it coming up on the, sorry about that. Okay, and here you need. Okay, next up we have the ADUniverse team.
Welcome to the non-cinematic universe of ADUs with executive producers Nick Welch, Rick Mohler, and Joe Hellerstein. Because this isn't cinema, we have to talk about the housing crisis in Seattle, which is something we're all affected by. Adrian is affected by it. Emily is affected by it. Miu is affected by it. Anagha, and I'm affected by it. More and more people pour into Seattle, right? But the number of the housing is just not built to keep up with that demand at that same rate. In 2016, for example, 27,000 people moved into Seattle, but only 6,000 housing units were built. Of course, that leads to a housing shortage. It leads to pressure on the existing housing units. It leads to huge spikes in the living costs. Renters can no longer, never really could, live in all of these high rises that are being built. Potential homeowners can't buy these homes that they're wanting to buy because the prices just keep going up. So what do we do? One potential solution to this is the accessory dwelling unit. This is a second home on top of an existing single-family parcel that a whole other family can live in. It could be either an attached and these attached AADUs are, for instance, basements or garages. They could be detached units, which are individual living structures, and all of these units have their own entrances, their own facilities, everything, so that an individual family can have their own space. And these second homes really matter because 3/4 of the residential area in Seattle is taken up by single-family lots. Let me emphasize that that is 75% of a residential area. These single-family areas have the most access to most of the schools, most of the parks, the public amenities, everything, right? So if you can't buy a single-family home, you don't get access to most of these units. ADUs, though, because they are on single-family units, could have access to these. ADUs could be built to age in place, so you don't have to pay these exorbitant fees for senior living facilities. They could be used to house a relative, maybe a young son or daughter just out of college who can't afford rents in the city. They could be used for rental income for struggling homeowners. And these are all benefits that Seattle understands and recognizes. So on July 9th of this year, the Seattle City Council passed a huge bill that dramatically increased people's ability to build ADUs on their property. They did, for instance, now bigger ADUs could be built on smaller lots. 2 ADUs could be built instead of just 1. If you don't have an extra parking space for the extra tenant, that's okay too, right? But just because people can build it, will they? The first legislation that was passed to permit ADUs to be built on single-family lots was passed in 1994. That was 25 years ago, and yet currently 2% of Seattle's single-family lots have an ADU. Only 0.7% of single-family lots eligible for a DADU have one. So although we had this very progressive ADU legislation of any major US city, at the same time, as essential as it is, as much as it's a backbone, it's not quite enough. Just because people can build an ADU doesn't mean that they will, because it's about education also. It's about feeling confident in making choices, having options, being supported. And knowing this, the Seattle City Mayor, Jenny Durkin, signed an executive order on ADUs in which one section provisioned DSSG to produce 3 things. One, that is a historical analysis of the factors that influence people to build ADUs on their property. The second is a user tool, a tool that would allow any homeowner to go in and check their property for details. Can I build an ADU on my property physically? Is it possible? What's the financial feasibility of building something like this? Other questions like that. And the third piece that was really essential was having a citywide neighborhood by neighborhood analysis to guide policy, to guide city planners to target interventions so that they could decide, for instance, where to support low-income homeowners by providing some financing to build these ADUs, to really maximize the ADUs in Seattle. Because again, at the core, it's all about education. And so here we are. We were able to witness this historic passing of this legislation. Our team, led by Nick and Rick, we toured these DADUs, AADUs. We presented to the Planning Commission, all while meeting stakeholders, getting input for our final output, this user tool, one package that would allow a user to go in and understand, can I build this tool physically on my property? Can I budget it? Is it financially feasible for me to do something like this? To have links for architects or the city offices to get started with the permitting process, as well as, and this up here is the navigation menu for our current user tool. The last bit, we give access to all of the citywide analysis that we did, which will also show you. Future parts of this tool might, for instance, give you access to pre-approved DADU and maybe AADU plans so that you would be able to quickly start that permitting process, because that can be burdensome too. You might get access to financing from the city if you're maybe a low-income homeowner. So all of this aside, the first bit, the most essential first piece, is the physical feasibility. As a homeowner, can I build an AADU or a DADU on my property? And for that, I'll hand it off to Emily.
So as a homeowner undertaking this decision of whether or not to build an AADU or a DADU, I'm faced with this extraordinary gap in knowledge. What do I need to consider? Can I build this? Is it even feasible given my current property? And so our user tool provides an easy-to-use, simple interface for allowing homeowners to simply enter their address and obtain these answers. So this gives you a sense of what our first outputs are as far as the app. If I enter my address, I'm first alerted to the fact that my home is eligible to build an AADU, so an attached ADU. Now, it turns out all single-family lots in Seattle are eligible to build an AADU. So this happy news is really part of the goal of increasing awareness about the diversity of options that homeowners have available to them in terms of accessory dwelling units writ large. You can also see that this house is eligible for a DADU. Now, a lot of information goes into this eligibility decision. So based on the new eligibility criteria laid out in the most recent legislation in July, you need to be in a single-family zone. Your lot needs to be greater than 3,200 square feet. Can't have more than 35% of the lot covered. Dimensions need to be 25 by 75 feet or above, and it can't be near a shoreline district. Now, as a homeowner, I may not have immediate access to all this information, or I may have to obtain that information piecemeal. We take all this, aggregate it, and provide all the information up front, allowing the homeowner to see whether or not their parcel is eligible by these hard criteria. Further, we provide the actual specifications of the homeowner's lot so they can see how they rank on each of these criteria or understand what factors might be prohibitive for them. Further, instead of sort of going through this process of having piecemeal information and not really understanding where you might be disqualified, we provide a very simple, straightforward answer if a parcel is not eligible for an AADU or DADU, and then illustrate why that parcel is not eligible. So folks are getting a clear answer, can I do it, yes or no? But this is not all about just the binding constraints of the legislation. There's also other factors or soft constraints that a homeowner will need to consider that they may not be able to conceptualize offhand. So what we do is aggregate information about other details about the characteristics of the property and about the buildings located thereon, and we give the homeowner some tips and some consideration. So let's look at this one. This first is dealing with the year the house was built. So if I have an older house and I'm considering building an AADU, that's all well and good, but I may have to consider inspection costs. I may have to consider sort of renovations. These are things that I need to have on my mind as I'm doing the decision calculus. We also provide positive considerations, things that might contribute to, say, the utility of the space as a rental unit, things that might contribute to the actual attractiveness of that rental unit to potential renters. And further, you can see if there are aspects of the home that make it particularly suitable to either an AADU or a DADU, we highlight that as well. And also, we're listing considerations that the homeowner may not have at the forefront of their mind, things like side sewer conflicts, things that maybe most people are not primed to think about initially, but they'll have to have at the forefront of their consciousness if they're undertaking this decision. But on top of this, another functionality of this ADUniverse suite of tools is really to build a network of community resources. And for that reason, one of the functionalities we offer in the app is a way of identifying other AADUs and DADUs in your area. So if I list my address, I can see that I have a swell of neighbors who might be able to share their expertise with me, or may allow me to come and see their unit and determine whether that's something that I want to take on. So we're building a network and a community of information sharing around AADUs. And so the beauty of this, all of this data is public access information. This is all from King County Assessor's data and City of Seattle GIS, all open data. But it's in a lot of discrete locations. What we're doing is that we're bringing this all together and leveraging it so that the homeowner can make a responsible decision, an informed decision, and also so that we can pass this data off to the city who can then take this to scale. But beyond the physical feasibility, now I have to consider, do the numbers make sense?
Now assume for a second that I own a house in Seattle, which I really like the assumption, and I wish it's true. But let's stay with the assumption for a minute. Now with this great tool, it tells me I'm eligible to build ADUs. So what's next? How much is going to cost me? The answer is, it depends. It depends on the type, if that's an attached ADU or detached ADU. And it also depends on the size of ADU you want to build. The larger you want to build, it's going to be more expensive to build. And then I can play around with this tool and select. Say I want to build a detached ADU and I want to build a 600 square feet ADU, which is approximately 1 bedroom. And what are the costs? I have no idea. And then this tool tells me item by item, what are the costs going to be if I want to build this ADU. And now we highlight, and it actually matters a lot, the type of ADU you're trying to build. For example, on the left-hand side is attached ADU, and on the right-hand side is detached ADU. Attached ADU is more like remodeling, getting an addition to your existing house. But for a detached one, it's a little bit more like building a new house. So it's significantly more expensive for the construction cost. And then all the associated costs of building ADU will go up proportionally when the hard construction cost goes up. So for example, if we look at the figure on the right-hand side, at the bottom will tell me it's going to cost me approximately $200,000 for me at least to build a 600 square feet detached ADU. But I don't have the money, so what I should do, what are the financial options I have to think about? Say I have, let's assume I have $100,000. I still need to pull another $100,000. So where do I get this money? If I already own a house, and then that means I've already have some equities in my house. And it's very common also based on the experience of ADU construction in Portland. A lot of ADU builders, they use home equity loans, which are called HELOC loans. And in order for me to finance that, for example, I'm trying to borrow a loan for 15 years under a fixed rate for $150,000, and this tool tells me, oh, my monthly payment will be a little bit above $1,000. And also, I understand that I'm making my house more valuable. What's the implication for my property tax? And this tool also tells me the potential increase in my property tax. Oh, there is a reminder there. My HELOC loan interest is tax deductible. Great. Those are the costs. Software costs have to think, what are the benefits? People build ADUs for various different purposes. They may want to rent it out, the ADU, and then there is a calculator to estimate the monthly rental. Assume I have this house around a university neighborhood, which is the zip code of 98105. And you can, depend on where you live, you can modify this zip code, and it will give you a corresponding value for the type of ADU, depends on the type of ADU you wanted to build. It gives you an estimated rental income value. And then I know, things happens, potentially I want to sell this ADU in future. And then I want to understand how much of this ADU construction will actually add to the value of my house. And then this tool also conveniently tell me this value. And we did all this construction based on the open source data provided by the economics team of Zillow. So those are all the financial cost and benefit analysis I have to go through for this ADU construction, and this tool provides everything I need for the financial consideration. But that's just thinking about me. But it's more than me in Seattle. And now we will move to the aggregate level analysis from our colleague Adrian.
So we're going to take a trip to a place called Proto ADUniverse, more colloquially known as Seattle. So now that we're all comfortable with where we're at right now, we're going to go over this view for a minute to kind of give you a sense of what a viewer coming into the app will want to think about when trying to figure out where exactly are the ADUs currently that exist in Seattle. So going off this view, we can look at the value scale to see that the maximum number of ADUs we found in any particular community is 42. So we go over to the darkest aspect of the map and we see that community is Greenwood. And we see that there are 42 detached ADUs in that neighborhood. However, of the total parcels eligible to create ADUs, 383827 in particular, that is a very small number of ADUs actually in that community. But we also know that there are no communities with more ADUs than this number here. So let's dig just a little bit deeper to get some context here. So we're going to stay focused on Greenwood for a minute, and we of course see that the number remains 42. If we take the distraction to the right just a minute here, we can also see that there are 50 attached accessory units within Greenwood. Now, bringing back our attention to the detached units, if we switch our view, which our tool gives you the option to do, to the uptake percentage within Greenwood, we see that there are roughly just a little over 1% of the units actually taking advantage of their ability to create detached ADUs. So the takeaway here is that looking at Greenwood alone, there is a lot of opportunity to expand our ADUniverse, and this tool helps kind of communicate that. So now we want to think about the housing affordability crisis. And so as Niu said, if we're looking at just our units, we're focusing on ourselves. So now the question is, if we want to address the housing affordability crisis, we have to get the city involved. City planners, policymakers, things of that nature. So we thought, what is useful information for them looking at this problem? And that is what this view was meant to help us address. Now, if you notice, the different shades of orange have a different interpretation on this map. So the darker a shade of orange that we see, the more eligible parcels that are in that community to build a detached ADU on their lot. So looking at one of the darker shades on the map, we go south to Mid-Beacon Hill. So we see that indeed there are a large number of eligible parcels in this community, but we also take a look at the median household income, and we see it to be around $70,000. We can easily see that there may be a cost-prohibitive nature here to making this a very difficult opportunity to take advantage of people that live in this community. But maybe that's not all you want to know to be conscientiously thinking about how do we address the housing affordability crisis. And so we dig just a little bit deeper into Mid-Beacon Hill. And so what we have on this view here, focusing just on Mid-Beacon Hill, are some population statistics that may be of interest. So just to kind of go through the measures here, by percentage, we see that roughly just over 30% of populated of the populated households have college degrees. Roughly 68% are homeowners in this community, which can be very useful information to know if you're kind of thinking of a strategy that can use maybe home equity loans. The non-white percentage here is roughly 68, or actually about 70+% here. That could be useful information to consider when thinking about how to strategize your communication. And then, of course, public transportation is a factor as well, and that's just about 20% in Mid-Beacon Hill. So now that we know we have this knowledge at our disposal for any single-family community within the neighborhood, within Seattle in general, what do we do with this information? What opportunities does this provide us with? And we're going to bring it all home now. So two big numbers we want to bring into consideration. One is this number of 114,000. What this number signifies for us is the number of parcels within the city that are eligible for an attached ADU. And so combined with this number is the number of eligible units for detached ADUs in the city, which is just over around 107,000. Now these numbers are not mutually exclusive. So any property may be able to build an attached and a detached ADU. So to put that into context, we're looking at possibly just over 200,000 possible units that can be added to help us address this housing affordability crisis. And these are units that can house maybe not just one person, but maybe families. So you get a sense of the scale here. So how do we go about building this ADUniverse? To put it somewhat poetically, you kind of want to bring the City Planning Commission and homeowners into harmony. So what this does for us, the app is intended to do, which is a prototype by the way, is it gives you a one-stop shop to learn about what are your financing options, how much would it cost me to build an ADU, what kind of policies are involved, is my parcel going to have any concerns for me to think about. All this is in one place in the tool that we're presenting for you. And so, my clicker still works for me. So now that we actually have the prototype of this tool, where do we go from here? So the number one thing for us after this program is over is to get this tool vetted, adopted, and then sent live by the City of Seattle. We'll be passing this over to the City of Seattle IT, and from there they will push our prototype live. But then thinking beyond that and address this crisis, we have to think of how do we still make it an accessible option for people? How do we put policy behind it? How do we put partnerships behind it? And the block project is actually one that addresses more of the homelessness crisis that is the byproduct of the housing affordability crisis as well. All these things will be referenced in by our vision going forward. And we also see that if this solution, this partial solution to address this crisis actually takes off, it could be looked at as a model across the nation because this solution is very Seattle-based, but the issue is nationwide. So in a nutshell, if we're to wrap up what this entire project has done for ADUs, we would say it's one small step for ADUs, one giant leap for ADUniverse. And just a word from one of our sponsors, the Dove chocolate that kept this all alive. And we would like to finish off with, of course, a thanks for all of our actual sponsors, and thank you for your time. Okay, one last thing I want to add. In the reception, when this is all over, we'll actually have our app live if you want to kind of test it out or give feedback. So just letting that be known of people looking forward to it. Take questions now. Yes. Yeah, we use primarily Python, and then we use Dash to kind of get a lot of the visuals up. Some of the DASH, Dash, and some of the views were created in Python. And just for reference, the question was what app technologies did we use to actually get the app up? Yes.
This was a great presentation. I was wondering where you're getting the data for the construction and other costs.
There you go.
So the question is, where do we get the numbers for the construction cost? So we follow the formula provided, produced by the city environmental impact report. We borrow the calculator over there. All the numbers are the same used in the report.
This was a great presentation, thank you. Have you considered combining your analysis with a similar analysis from Krafft and Party?
I guess I'll take. You want to take it? Go for it.
So the question was, have we considered combining our analysis with similar analysis on transportation and parking? The answer at this point is no, but
I think from the standpoint of increasing the impact of this work, it would be really helpful. So if you have references that you're willing to provide, I think to the extent that we can, you know, find how those are speaking to each other, that would be really helpful.
I think we do, just because your presentation went a little bit longer, we need to probably put questions there, but please stay after and direct your questions. I know the team would love to have the opportunity to answer them. And come play with us. You guys are doing your own laptop.
We actually moved it over, so it should be present now.
Oh, okay.
In peer support, yeah.
Just as a brief heads up, again, we're going to be discussing some sensitive subjects around mental health. So if you feel uncomfortable around topics involving self-harm or suicide, we just want you to be aware that it's perfectly okay. We will not be offended if you need to leave.
Yeah, okay, got it. Okay, so next up we have our peer support group.
Hi, everyone. Hello, everyone. We are the Natural Language Processing for Online Peer Support Group. I'm Kelly McMeekin.
I'm David Lang.
Our apparently very proud team leads are Dave and Tim right there. And our data scientist is Valentina, who's right there. 1 in 4 young adults is affected by mental illness every year. In the last 10 years, the rate of major depressive episodes has increased by 67% for those between the ages of 18 and 25. This age demographic is now the group with the largest or highest rate of mental illness. And yet, they're also the group that is the least likely to have received mental health services. So we have a big problem that needs a big solution. And no surprise, tech steps in. In the last 5 years, the number of apps and sites that are targeted towards mental health and proclaim to help mental health has increased dramatically. Some of these platforms offer professional counseling, while others offer AI chatbots, discussion forums, peer support, or even games. This summer, we specifically looked at one aspect of mental health care, which is peer support. For those of you who are unfamiliar, here's a kind of working definition. Peer support is when people provide knowledge, emotional support, or practical help to each other based on a shared experience of emotional or psychological pain. It is the common experience that makes peers qualified to assist one another, although in some instances, peer counselors do also, or peer supporters do also receive additional training. Of course, as you would expect, when you have peers that are supporting one another, some attempts are more helpful than others. And that brings us to our guiding research question this summer. What types of responses are the most helpful to individuals sharing their mental health struggles online? The deliverable for our project was explanatory research. We were looking to examine a question that is an emerging field that has not yet been well studied. In order to answer this question, we studied an online peer support platform for mental health who provides mental health support to those who need it. The goal of our research on this specific platform was to then provide them with actionable suggestions for how to encourage more helpful comments on the platform. The platform provided us with restricted access to a database of over 200 million rows of public conversations, user behavior, and demographics. The data consisted of over 500,000 users, the majority of whom are female, and a median age of 19. The platform is maintained and supervised by fewer than 50 admins and moderators. On the platform, users can create posts which they categorize by mood and category. Other users can then comment on the posts, and the original poster can then choose to engage with any of the commenters by responding back, liking a comment, following the commenter, or directly messaging them. To take us a bit deeper into the data, I'll hand off to my colleague David.
One of the first things we realized when we started looking at this platform is that actually, it's not just about mental health. That many of these platforms are actually a mix of social media, discussion of music, as well as mental health. So the first thing we did was we narrowed down our data set to what we thought was the mental health portion of the platform. And in total, that gave us around 2 million question and comment pairs to examine. And one of the things that we really struggled with is how do we wrap our minds around this many comments and questions? That ideally we want a framework to understand what types of problems people are experiencing, as well as being able to attach a label to them so that they might be able to be directed in the future. So one of the things we did was we used a technique called topic models, which what it does is take words and looks at their co-occurrence in posts and maps them into unsupervised categories. And what we found was that the top post, the most common type of post was an expression of despair. And just to give you a brief flavor of that, we have a sample below. Sometimes I get so lonely I can't help but feel sad, and then I'm angry for being that way. I want you to take a moment to think about how would you respond to an individual who expresses that sentiment. They posted it on a forum, you might not know anything about them. What type of response do you think might be appropriate? Well, one of the common responses we see is something that we ultimately call broad encouragement. And so that's a statement along the lines of, I know things are tough for you right now, but I know you can get through this. Was that comment helpful? Is that typical of what goes on in these platforms? One of the things we found out that while this behavior is common and this approach to try and offer peer support is used quite often, it's actually not even the most common expression of support on these platforms. In fact, the most common strategy that individuals use is they relate things to their own personal experience, their own life and their own personal experiences. So, ultimately what we're trying to do is identify behaviors of peers that are supportive of individuals. So in terms of translating that to a data science problem, we are going to take post and comment characteristics, so things like the actual text as well as characteristics of the users, put them in a machine learning model and try and identify whether or not a particular comment was helpful or not. So that leads us to our sort of next challenge is how do we define helpfulness? In the ideal state of the world, you can imagine that there are a couple of sets of outcomes you might want to look at. One is professionally annotated data by a clinician or psychologist. Another is some sort of revealed preference measure, asking individuals, was that comment helpful to you? And the third is you might be able to look at some sort of mental health assessment. Unfortunately, many of these tools don't really scale when you're talking about a platform of hundreds of thousands of users. So instead, we leaned on the social network analysis literature and looked at social media signals as a proxy of helpfulness. For instance, this might be something like you post an expression of frustration and a user responds and you like that comment, or you say, give a general expression of gratitude by saying thank you, that really helped. Or perhaps when you express your mood on the following day, we can detect a noticeable elevation. Now, one of the things that we want to be very clear and transparent about is that these measures can be problematic, that when a person likes something, it might not necessarily be because it's helpful, but because it's funny, or just because you already have a pre-existing social relationship with that person. And in addition to this, one of the challenges that we have with this platform is that the median user is only on the platform for 2 days. So to the extent that we're interested in measuring long-term health outcomes and long-term changes in mental health, that's quite frankly very tricky. So one of the things that we did look at as to examine the face validity of these measures is we looked at how often they occur. And if you believe this as a measure of helpfulness, they actually occur quite often. So nearly half of all posts eventually have some expression associated of some expression of gratitude associated with it. That being said, one of the things that we would have liked to have seen is that these gestures and measures of gratitude tended to co-occur. And in fact, what we see is that they really don't. That typically you want to see an interclass correlation of around 0.6 or higher. And here we see that it's actually around 0.23. So what that means is that what we define as our key measure of helpfulness is actually a very faithful choice. But before we get into that, what I want to emphasize is that we also want to identify something tractable and intelligible to provide back to this platform, to identify strategies that might be helpful, as well as behaviors that might be able to be encouraged on this type of platform. And we sort of group this into two broad categories. There's sort of specific words and biologic moves that an individual could make. That might be doing something like saying you're strong, or brave, or resilient, or empowered. Or there could be specific behaviors that a peer could make. And what we thought would be most applicable is if we could identify behaviors of clinicians and map that to the types of moves that these peers made. And that's exactly what we did. We contacted a colleague at the University of Utah, and he provided us with a machine learning model that was trained on clinical data to predict the presence of certain clinical moves. Specifically, these moves are called ORs. And what they correspond to are 4 broad sets of strategies with regards to how you interact with patients. These are the usage of open questions. How does that make you feel? Affirmations. Reflective commentary. And summarizing the individual's thoughts. And what we see is when we sort of map these measures into a peer support space, is that the distribution of these strategies and tools are quite different than that of traditional counseling. Specifically, I want you to focus on that top blue bar, and that is a strategy called giving information. Typically, this behavior is very rare in counseling sessions, but it represents nearly half of all activity on a peer support platform. So one of the sort of immediate takeaways that we should understand when examining these types of tools is that peer counseling and clinical counseling are not the same. With that, I'm going to hand things off to my colleague Shweta.
So coming off of that understanding of our platform and the way that we've decided to operationalize our analysis, we're going to delve into some of the findings from our research over the summer. Just as a reminder, we're going to be using the terms helpful and not helpful over the course of the rest of the presentation. And so when we're talking about helpfulness, we're specifically talking about these proxies or likes, follows, and expressions of gratitude. And so though over the course of the summer we ran our models on each of these proxies individually, for the course of this presentation, the results that we're presenting are basically looking at the outcome of any of the above, which means that any one of these proxies was present for a particular comment in the data. And so when I say helpful, that basically means when I say that a comment was found to be helpful, that means that it was more likely to have one of these proxies present. And when we say not helpful, that basically means it was not as likely to have these proxies present. So before we dive into insights from the language used on these platforms, we wanted to look at user characteristics because it's not just important what was said, but also who said it. So it is possible that there are just some users who are more likely to receive these proxies like likes and follows than others. And what we found in our data was that female users, younger users, and those who generally had larger networks, followed more people and were followed by more people, were more likely to receive the proxies that we're looking at. We then wanted to dive into looking at counseling behaviors. So So the behaviors, the motivational interviewing techniques that we identified, we wanted to see if peers actually make use of these techniques, does that actually result in more helpful outcomes? And what we found was that while simple reflection, affirmations, and summarization was positively correlated to more helpful outcomes, open questions were not found to be helpful on the platform. This initially confused us, but when we looked at it closely, we realized that just the nature of the platform and the nature of our analysis has a lot to do with this. So while traditional counseling is a much longer process of back and forth conversation between a counselor and a client, their open questions are used to extract more information about a client's circumstances. So when you think about a peer support platform where you're really dealing with users who you don't know, usually have just one interaction with them, there an open question is not the kind of comment that would elicit likes or follows as a result. And so that is why we think that we found this particular result. Going into the actual language and words used on the platform, we looked at comments to understand what kind of comments are people finding to be helpful and what they're not finding to be helpful. So on the positive end of the spectrum, we found that affirmative language, encouraging language, pushing people to fight through their struggles, and offering availability, offering to speak to somebody in case they need someone to talk to, were found to be helpful sorts of techniques on the platform. On the other hand, we found that the use of more flippant, casual language, as well as a lot of use of negating language, particularly the word don't showed up a lot, was found not to be helpful. And when we specifically dug deeper in our analysis on posts that were of a more serious and critical nature, dealing with suicide and self-harm, what we found was that a lot of negating language was actually users who were dissuading their peers from engaging in self-harm, using language like don't end your life, reconsider that. That's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But we found that that was not really correlating well with our helpfulness indicators. And this provided us with an important insight into the nature of peer support platforms and what they can and what they can't offer. So what peer support does seem to do well is offer a place to make connections, to feel heard, to feel understood. But in more critical circumstances, there is a limit to what untrained peers can really offer in terms of support. Besides the actual words and language used on the platform, we also created a few features from the text ourselves. And some of those that came out to be interesting were that longer comments tended to correlate positively with our helpfulness measures. Maybe that indicates some kind of increased level of thoughtfulness or effort on the part of a commenter. And we also found that the use of second-person pronouns, so language that is directed towards you rather than I, where the commenter is talking more about the person who needs help rather than themselves, was found to be more helpful. In terms of how our models did across all of our different outcome measures, we had an accuracy ranging between 58 to 62%, and our bag of words models performed a lot better than the models where we used the features that we had engineered. And so this reveals that there is some amount of explainability within the text itself in terms of these helpful measures that we're looking at, but there is a lot still that we haven't been able to capture within the model, and there is a lot of complexity at play on a platform like this. And so some of that could be just subjective content about what are the user circumstances, what is the user going through on the platform. When we dug deeper into posts that were of a more critical nature, where people were talking of suicide and self-harm, we actually found that those individuals were less likely to use any of our helpfulness proxy measures across the board. And other factors like social network dynamics, like how many people are posting at the same time as me, what is really popular, what is getting attention, are all factors that would affect the results of an analysis like this. And so we're hopeful that further research into this will find better ways to incorporate these complexities into that analysis. And we also want to just reiterate that we understand that these are proxies that we're looking at, and these proxies are far from perfect measures of helpfulness itself. And so we're hopeful that further research will look at more robust measures of helpfulness that come from surveys or annotation, so that we can see whether the findings that we have really translate into that space as well. With that, I'll pass it back to Kelly to go over the takeaways from the summary.
Last week we met with Charisse Williams, who's the Assistant Director of UW's Counseling Center. As a professional mental health therapist, she, of course, shared with us some of her concerns over these platforms. And so to conclude, I'd like to walk you through her take on the platforms combined with our research and our observations. So first of all, to reiterate once again, we need better ways to measure helpfulness. As we discussed, there were a lot of caveats for the proxy measurements that we used, and further research would be needed to determine whether or not these proxies match up with mental health, what the mental health world considers to be helpful both short-term and long-term. Since these platforms are targeted towards mental health, though, being able to assess mental health standards, being able to assess helpfulness by mental health standards should be a key part of further investigation and platform design. Secondly, we need better and more moderation. So on the platform that we studied, moderators are unpaid, trained volunteers, and administrators are employees. And they are both responsible for removing content that contains dangerous, unsafe, or violent acts. Actually measuring the percentage of posts that contains this type of content is very complex, but based on our own calculations, we estimate that at least 10% of the mental health content posted on the platform was about suicide or self-harm alone, not including other types of posts that could fall into the category of dangerous, unsafe, or violent. When we look at just this content that is related to suicide and to self-harm, we found that only 2.5% was deleted by an admin or moderator. Research into non-suicidal self-injury as well as suicidal contagion has demonstrated that access to this type of content can be triggering and even incite this type of behavior. So the fact that this much suicidal content and self-injury content is staying on the website is hugely problematic. Thirdly, peer support is not suitable for all mental health problems. As Shweta mentioned, our analysis into the content of posts suggested that posts related to building community, to feeling heard, and to being encouraged were more appropriate for a peer support platform. And research into peer support does back up that idea. In formal settings such as psychiatric hospitals, peer support is a tool that's usually used in conjunction with professional services, rather than alone. Individuals experiencing serious mental health challenges simply need more than what peer support can offer. Furthermore, without training into how to maintain an appropriate and healthy emotional distance and to avoid compassion fatigue, peer supporters shouldn't be attempting to manage these complex issues by themselves. Platforms need to be more upfront with users about this fact, especially if there is not a professional moderator who is there to take over when the content starts to become above the level that is appropriate for a peer supporter. Lastly, we need much better ways to deal with suicidal content. Since 2013, suicide has been the second leading cause of death for individuals from age 10 to 34. If you have a platform that is about mental health, you are going to have content that is about suicide. This is a huge problem and one that needs to be a priority in design. Simply deleting the post or sending the users the phone number for the suicide hotline is not enough. If users are coming to the platform looking for support, which the platform claims to give them, they need to also follow through with that by helping them through this process. The data that we looked at this summer was not just numbers and strings of text. It was pleas for help from a population that we have not done enough to support. Our most vulnerable populations are using these platforms with little accountability and oversight. When we talked with Charisse Williams, the Assistant Director of UW's Counseling Center, she said one thing that really stuck with all of us. Whenever she goes into a counseling session, her goals are as follows. First, do no harm, then try to help. To the existing peer support platforms and mental health tech, this should be where you start. To the researchers that are looking at their data, this should be what you prioritize. And to anyone who is interested in, motivated by, or attempting to do data science for social good, this should be where you start. You cannot fix a problem until you understand it. You cannot help unless you first understand how to not help, not harm. Thank you.
Have some
At the risk of overly simplifying, how are these businesses profitable? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, like what is the business?
Okay. Well, like any sort of social media platform, they rely partly on advertisements. And in addition to that, the platform has microtransactions. So for instance, pieces of flair, emojis, those sorts of things, those are one component of how the company monetizes its users and its interactions. That is a really deep question, and again, I wanna make sure you do it justice. Are these sort of peer counseling platforms engaged in sort of contradictory or at least conflicting incentives where they want to retain their users? I think that's a common concern in almost every element and aspect of mental health. I think it's nothing new in the sense that that has been a critique of traditional therapy, that some people have that perception. I think at the end of the day, most firms have some sort of mix of goals between both executing social good as well as achieving profitability. I really can't get into the specifics because we have yet to really engage with the firm on their views and their values, though. But I think it's a very real risk, and it's something that we are definitely mindful of and have discussed intensively amongst our team.
Earlier when you were talking about the accuracy of that one score remodel and how it was really on label and helpful versus not helpful, I believe that's what the task was. Was there any attempt to sort of stratify into time segments? Because I can imagine that over time, what might be helpful at one point becomes overused, and users don't like it. I don't know if there's any attempt to look at that, or if that's possible.
We did usually. Yeah, so the question is basically about whether we try to stratify our analysis to look at whether helpfulness in what is not helpful and not helpful changes over time. When we actually filtered our data set, we filtered it down to just one particular time period of 2018 itself. So by the time we got to running our models, they were taking very long to run, and so we filtered our data set down. So we weren't really able to do that kind of analysis, but it's definitely something that would be interesting to look at. The question is just about how did we filter our data set down and get rid of the social media content and decide what was relevant. So when a user makes a post on this platform, they actually select like a mood to begin with. And so there are negative and positive moods there that they pick, and they also pick like a category for the post that they're creating. So those were 2 points of reference that we had based on which we were able to filter. Along with that, we used dictionaries basically of negative emotion words. So we collected those, and there are also certain trigger words that the platform itself identifies, which helps them identify individuals who are going through serious crisis. So we basically created like a dictionary of all of these words together. And the data set that we were really interested in was where users are actually dealing with mental health challenges and are actually asking for help. So that really became our focus.
Yeah, with regards to the first part about what are sort of the other positive alternative outcomes we looked at, one of the things that we really did, and one of the things I really appreciate about the DSSG program, is we interviewed many stakeholders from similar types of firms and entities. Specifically, we talked to crisis counselors, we talked to people who worked at suicide hotlines. And one of the things that really sort of surprised us in terms of what they used as their outcome was whether or not a person hung up the phone with their own agency and own willingness. And it's something that we've been thinking about a lot in terms of mapping what a good, high-quality, long-term outcome would be. But we haven't really explored that space. Kelly, do you want to answer the second part?
To the second part about professional help, the short answer is no. So when somebody posts something that is categorized as suicidal on the platform, other users are encouraged to tag that post for removal and to provide them with a suicide hotline, but that's kind of the extent. They have a resources page that they have that you can navigate to that says, here are some options. That being said, I'm going to go a little rogue here. If we go back to I just want to draw attention to this because I think it's really important. One of the concerns about peer support platforms is that if they dissuade people from getting professional help. And if you look at the comments on the right-hand side, the ones that don't show up with our helpfulness indicators, there are actually a lot of comments that talk about, for example, clinical therapy, seek help. And that is, again, as we talk for a real need for further research, that could be indicative of a bigger problem we don't really know, right? But another thing just to mention.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our data science for social good student fellows, the project leads and the data scientists who make these teams and this work possible, as well as, once again, the great numbers of sort of staff members who are involved in various ways in this program. So if we could all give a round of applause to them. I expect you're all as amazed as I am at what they're able to produce in 10 weeks, much of which the first 2 weeks, if you ask them, are spent in a lot of tutorials and other kinds of activities. So it's pretty remarkable. I hope you'll all join us. We have a reception up in the WRF Data Science Studio, which is just across the courtyard here up in the Physics Astronomy Tower on the 6th floor. We will have food and beverages and opportunities to interact with the fellows and ask them your more detailed questions and maybe play around with their apps. Thanks.